I could barely hold my breath last night. Like it was just, okay, I got to get ready to actually have this conversation, because when I sit here now and think back, I just want to weep. And I think part of the weeping is the crying I just didn't have time to do then. And then I think about people who can't tell war stories till 2 generations later, right? At some point, the time for the story comes. And so I'll tell this as I need to tell this story. But what I'm aware of today is like, oh, fuck, that was hard. That was really hard. And I don't know how we just kept getting up and doing the day and doing the week and saying goodbyes and saying hellos and, just that moving. So the bereavement project started then in 1994, but up until then, Wayne and I had been working in AIDS in the death years, right? Where that was your job, was helping people die in the most dignified way you possibly could, who were your age, the people you partied with, in Wayne's case, people that were your lovers, and just trying to have people have a death where they're held by people who love them, people who will tell their stories, and then doing that over and over and over again, because what the living and the dying needed was more important than the grief that the rest of us were sitting in. But at some point that tilts, doesn't it? Like at some point it calls to be dealt with. So that became the roots of the bereavement project. The context, this is Reba and Edwin had come to us with a particular framework for grief and loss. And I say the word framework because having an understanding of what's happening is everything to me. I think if there have been different people, things might have looked different, but I actually need to understand. So I'm one of those grievers who, yes, I got lots of feeling, but honestly, I have to have an understanding of what I'm doing, how it makes sense to me. And then I have to agree to cooperate, because the feelings are not easy for me, but creating an understanding is useful. And I remember in those early days when we were working with stage theory of grief, right? So the Kubler-Ross stuff. And even if you make it more complicated, it's still that notion of stages of grief, but at least there was language, And then I also understood between me and Wayne was so interesting. I was the head case and he was the experiential one. So just having a human being in my team, my teammate who came at grief differently, meant right off the bat, we had to look at ways to talk about this differently. And the big thing we understood from Reba and Edwin was, this is complicated. And whatever we were reading in the literature, we had to keep looking at ourselves as we are experiencing normal grief and an abnormal time. We are not abnormal, because too much of the, just already we had that history as queers about we're already something wrong with us. And then AIDS, you got something else wrong. And are we going to have our grief? Is that going to be wrong too? And just resisting that. So our grief is perfectly normal. It's just complicated. And then, through that time, this is what it actually looked like, the extra magazine that would come out, and this is before any kind of social, the digital world, and poring over these. In this particular issue, there was something like 379 little pictures with names. You didn't even get an obit, and poring over these things and noticing, oh, I never knew that he had died. And then the sense of, I guess he's well now because I've been worrying about him. Or, oh, that's the guy who was the coffee guy on the second cup. And then he's dead now. Like just kind of trying to figure out your world, who's dead and who's alive. And this would be the way that we could do that. And about half of these folks were our clients, but the other half were part of community. And so what do you do with the impact of that when the extra comes out and you're looking at this? What do you do? Like, how do you process that? How do you go from that kick in your belly and the heart shattering to responding to it? And even if people would just go numb, that's not your real response. You just know that's your cloak, that you're putting on for the day. What do you do with this? We needed to give people something to do with this. And then our question became, you got all these little grief loops. What are you going to do with the grief loops, right? Your grief journey. What do you do with them? What happens with the unclosed grief loops? The place where you don't actually get to say goodbye, the place where there's been no memorial, the place where you're at somebody's funeral and crying about the guy who died last month. Like, what do you do with all this stuff? So you notice the verb tense there, right? My verb tense is what do you do, which puts me in I need to understand it so I can do something with it. And Wayne's side of the story was, I think we just need to feel this, Yvette. And that would be the tension between us. But when you think about complicated grief, or you think about diversity in grief styles, there's your intuitive and your instrumental grievers, right? Like, I need to do, he needs to experience, and we need to not fight with each other because both of us are right. Well, what we understood in these conversations, but sometimes you have so much death in a community that it stops being a list about who's died, and it becomes, there's a tipping point where it becomes what has died. And I started to articulate that as the loss of an assumptive world. The way that I understood the world to be was changing. Who was going to be there? How we understood community. All that was just, there was too much death, too much loss. And then your beliefs about identity. Who am I in relation to this assumptive world? Because it wasn't holding steady. And this started happening for me in around the early 90s. So that was about 8 years in the death years. And then, okay, so then how do we mourn when what you're mourning is an assumptive world and core beliefs about the world, and then about yourself in the world? And it's more than just a list of names. Well, that becomes where the tipping point is with bereaved families and more classically trained bereavement workers, right? So bereavement therapists. So we understood that we were literally off the map, and that we needed to create our own map, if you will. And this was the point for it. Up until that point, this is me, Wayne, working in Windsor in 1994. This was the loss journey that we dragged around on pieces of flip chart. So anybody who's, this is Wayne's writing, this is my writing, common myths, grief tasks, like we finally shifted from stage theory to task theory, Bill Warden's work. But this was the journey as we conceptualized it and as we talked about it. This was what we would drag around in a tube, like every place that we went in Ontario, bringing out these things and then inviting conversations in a group. And what we would get met with repeatedly was, what do you do with all the multiple losses? Like, this may be good if your dog dies or your lover dies or your mama dies, but what do you do when it's layered, layered, layered? And it creates a theoretical question, doesn't it, about how do you express that to people? Because the visuals became important. People would talk about the journey, the pit. People would hang on to this funny little image that we'd use, but it needed to be more complex because their experience was more complex. So started to track this in the early 90s, that what we were saying and the way that we were saying it was not sufficient for people. And, you know, went back to some of the early language about long-term survivors. And I think this was our ethic in the work, that as we continue to work and to open to what it meant to love people, work with people, lose people at that pace, was that trying to maintain our heart for the work and our heart for the world and our heart for community took courage. It takes courage to be able to open to the story that needs to be told. And that having a soft heart in a hard world, it was complicated back in the 90s. And I think it's even more complicated now, you know, in the decade that we're in. It's courage, not weakness. So let's open to the place of feeling and then honor it in a way. So we started, what we did with these conversations was that as people were living longer with HIV, they became the pressure for us in the loss theory. Your theory is inadequate. And we started to look at, I think we need separate bereavement groups for the people who are living with HIV, who expected to die and did not die. So that became the Survive to Thrive project, where we had funding, and specifically funding that we got from ACAP, to look at grief and loss through the lens of long-term survivors. And that's the project that took us around Ontario, looking for people who may not be going to an ASO anymore, but who were in community and were still alive, and looking at what was happening in their lives. And why we were doing that was that we were looking at not just talking about grief and loss, right? That's let me open to your pain. Let me help you open to your pain is too small. Let me help you open to conversations about meaning making in terms of your experiences. And that promoting activities that would look at strengthening individual and collective capacity, which we now call resilience, but back then we didn't have that language. So that's how we started the Survive to Thrive work. It wasn't about let's look at all this loss. It was how are we surviving with all this loss? So when we did our initial studies, our initial questionnaires for people, the multiple loss history questionnaire, what we saw with people is that on an average, people could name 157 deaths per person, per long-term survivor so far. So that's way off the grid of traditional bereavement, isn't it? Right? 157 deaths, and we understood so far. AIDS wasn't over then, it's not over now. And the first group we started to work with, so I'm gonna talk about them for a little minute. It was actually Ottawa. This was this wild group from Ottawa, PHAs, and they brought us back 3 times to work with them. And this was the group where the feistiness was. And so Wayne and I would go in and we do these retreats. And this was a particular day we were saying goodbye to a group member. And this group, just notice the diversity in this group, right? You've got the Ottawa group, you've got Francophones, you've got recent immigrants, you got the gay guys, you got women, like you just got a variety. And in the diversity comes a diversity around grief and loss, right? So that was fun, but they were the pressure point. And we were doing this work collaboratively with the Ontario AIDS Network then. And I just remember it was one session in particular where Wayne and I dragged out our little flip chart. And this was the group who said, oh, for God's sakes, Yvette, we don't want to see that anymore. We actually need to talk about multiple loss. So this was one of those moments of inspiration where Wayne and I think Thomas was there, we put down 16 pages of flip chart paper and we got markers and we said to people, tell us the words, tell us the words, tell us the words. What is your experience? And we actually started to draw what became the multiple loss journey that people are using now, but the words were really important. What does this word mean? Because we also needed to translate it into French at that point, because some people here, their English was not their first language. And being able to have that translation means that you sit with a word like, what does despair mean? And you spend time with the vocabulary. We did this again with the multiple loss journey in Spanish. So there's actually 3 versions of the multiple loss journey, but each of those became a community consultation, if you will, about the right nuance of the vocabulary of the word. So to Ottawa, to all these long-term survivors that are still and still not there, they were the group that finally just went, not enough, we need to do this differently. And that work has held. So we hauled around those flip chart papers to other groups. We went to Thunder Bay, and Renee is here in this group, and began to work with, if we actually start putting some things up on the wall, if we actually start putting it together, does it make sense? Does it hold? Does it hold when you're looking at, impacts of multiple oppressions in a group of people with HIV and community? And then the downtown Toronto guys, who then became the Survive to Thrive group, as part of that group continued to meet for 10 years. I look in these faces now and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 of these guys are dead. So that's over half of the group. And that comes with some poignancy. But this was a group that chose to meet to keep talking about how you move from surviving, our pandemic of the time, to actually thriving in that experience. Yeah. So with those groups, we can say that we became creators of the multiple loss journey, but it's actually through these, what I would call grounded experiential knowledge of groups across the province of Ontario, that helped us. And initially when people would come to us, the slide just popped up, they were saying, we are not dead. For crying out loud, I was hibernating. Don't you guys ever take a pulse? We are alive, and we are looking for ways to not just be the next guys who are going to die, because we have medication now we believe is going to keep us going. So that became an interesting conversation, right? With all this weird humor around death. Yeah. what strikes me about these faces, right, is, this was a little, it's going to take us a minute to get in with the Thunder Bay group, but who was a really pivotal leader, the two leaders, Pius White, and he's dead now, and Renee are the leaders that actually brought this work up there in a profound way. And part of what informed just the development was, searching for other loss, other communities, other people who would actually experience catastrophic loss, and how do people make sense of that? And it was Viktor Frankl's work. So this is Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, who was in the concentration camps as a Jewish man, and he wrote this phrase: people who lose the why to live may also lose the how to live. Right? This is where meaning and purpose and having a role in community and having a place where your story matters. This became really important to me around mental health in the community, because I understood that those of us who survived those death years, if we didn't do something to help figure it out, we weren't going to do well. We may be alive, but we weren't going to do well. So it's not just, let's just figure out I'm still alive, but how do I live that has meaning and purpose, that can, bring my history with me in a good way. What else do I want to talk about? Some of the critiques we were developing about grief then, that when we were thinking about the diagram needs to look different, but it needs to look different for reasons that make sense to us. And this is what we were evolving at that point. So we needed something that was going to help people understand what was happening to them with multiple loss, and then how to actually do something with it, right? So when you look at the multiple loss journey, which we will in a minute, the green hands at the bottom is what to do, how to bring a conversation. So that's really updated from Kubler-Ross's stage model. And we shifted to William Worden's task model very consciously, because he was talking to us from a notion of helping people see grief as a set of activities that they can enter into, do some work with, maybe revisit. But in terms of grief as empowering, it was his work, William Worden's work. And then we needed to help people celebrate attachment, because when you've got complicated loss, you just think attaching to people is a problem and you should stop doing it. Your heart won't be broken if you don't attach. So honoring attachment, we attach because we're human. We're frightfully human. We attach, and it's complicated, but it's a necessity as social beings. So bringing the attachment theory language forward. And then some people did work on how we actually grieve, right? Because this journey of loss is static, right? It's a line that goes like this. It's got some variations in it, but what helped us was Strub and Schutt developed a dual processing model that talked about every human being in loss has some time we need to think about loss, and sometime we need to think about what they call it restoration, a restoration orientation, a loss orientation. And what we do is oscillate between those two worlds. And I love that notion of oscillation, not a straight line, and just so that was really helpful to us. And there's a guy and his team in Portland, Robert Niermeyer, they talk about legacy and continuing bonds. You don't need to leave your dead person behind, right? You need to bring them with you as you live so that your life is bigger and richer. And that language is very common now in the bereavement world, but back then in the early 90s, it wasn't. Right? We didn't know. So is grief work successful when you don't cry anymore? Is grief work successful when you don't think about dead people anymore? Not for many cultures, and not in the community that we were living in. How do we tell people stories? How do we remember the people that we loved who made community? And Niermeyer's work, Continuing Bonds, was really helpful. And the woman who was the most useful, Therese Rando, traumatic grief. It's got to incorporate the notion of trauma, because you can't have a marginalized, oppressed community, multiple loss, catastrophic loss, and not have trauma elements. And up until then, you got your trauma people in a silo over here. You've got your, who do good work on traumatology. And then you've got bereavement people here who don't necessarily think about the trauma and grief. And Therese Rando started bringing that together in the 90s. So So when I say to people now, develop your own frameworks for grief, and what are the key components that you need to think about in developing your framework? These were ours. Go research, find other ways of thinking about this that make sense to you, and then incorporate them. What I know for sure is that it's got to give people a sense of trauma and loss, and it has to give people a sense of possibility and purpose, right? Otherwise, what's the end goal? You just feel the pain and then continue to live. Possibility and purpose is, how do I move forward with this? And then really simple language. What is grief and loss, right? We mourn because we are human, and we've attached and we've lost, and we will mourn to death, not to death. Things are tangible, things are not tangible. And intangible, how do we even begin to talk about the loss of an assumptive world, right? That's so intangible. And then some truisms, right? It's not linear. If you haven't dealt with stuff that happened when you were 15 years old, it's going to show up in the radar when you start to talk about loss. You know, it just will. And that doesn't mean you haven't done your work. That just means it comes time to revisit it. So when we were looking at developing a framework, all those elements needed to be in there, and it needed to be visual. People are visual, and it needed to be holistic was the other notion. And this comes from Indigenous ways of knowing. This was the gift from the elders that we worked with. And the one name I want to call here is Velma Orvis from Winnipeg, who came to sit with us. And what she said as her guidance to us is, whatever you do, it needs to take into consideration the whole person all the time. You know, your movement of grief is towards integration at a whole level, and grief is going to show up in a holistic framework. And just having that notion was incredibly helpful to us. Okay. And it began to give us language about how do we talk about grief physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, socially, sexually. Can't even spell sexually. How do we actually do that in a way that helps us feel whole, right? I always thought that grief was just here, emotional, and that I was either angry or sad. Mostly I was angry, and didn't understand anxiety as the dominant tone of multiple loss in a community. It generates anxiety. I didn't understand physical manifestations of grief, mental manifestations, or the spiritual manifestations. And being able to look at all those things together was just so freaking helpful. So this was the early one you saw in Wayne's map, and this is what we used to talk about. And I still use this map because Bess Will, it was drawn up by her, and what it gave us was a way to talk about storms and how storms impact our life. It was a visual reference. And you know, the weather inside, the weather outside, and the weather inside. And then the notion of a journey, which has movement, right? You've got a beginning, you've got a middle, you've got an end. And it's not quite like that, right? You can go back and revisit, but it gave people a sense of mastery. I'm going to be in something, it's going to get hard. It's got some words that I can learn. And at some point, I'm actually going to feel the shift in my life. And then I'm going to figure out how to move forward. Those elements held. Single loss, multiple loss. Those elements held. So this is the multiple loss journey as this is the chart I still have on my wall now, doing work with trauma survivors in a completely other sector. And sure, it was developed by ABRPO, but really the experience that's reflected here is from long-term survivors. It just is the gift. And so we call it grounded theory. We've tested this theory. We've done research about this journey. It's been talked about in various bereavement literature. The incorporation or the integration of, we still can talk about single loss in the multiple loss journey, right? You've got your multiple loss journey experience here, but I can be dealing with community devastation. And if my mother dies, I'm going to be on the blue line at the same time, right? It's not one or the other. So helping people have a sense of this has become important as a foundational tool. There's Bill Warden's tasks here. You have the elements of the journey. and then understanding how much more complicated it is in multiple loss environments. Originally, the map had this heading on it: multiple ongoing AIDS-related loss and community devastation. And it would scare people. It's like, this is way too big. I don't even know where to land. But if you were one of those people in that community, that title actually made sense to you. But when we started bringing this out to the bereavement world and to the harm reduction world and to the shelter system, we actually revised the name so people could find their way into it. And then we always honored it as something that was brought from the experience of long-term survivors. Yeah. So you'll notice the elements in here, right? We need to acknowledge the complexity of losses and include in the losses is a loss of self. The words are a little clearer here. And when you lose a community of meaning, right, part of what you also lose is yourself, loss of identity, loss of the assumptive world. And then when we're looking at the loss journey, part of the challenge in attaching is attaching to yourself again, right? Who am I now? Who am I right now? Attaching to self again. So we would work with long-term survivors, and there's lots of literature in the ABRPO files about those workshops where we would do exercises, we would do interesting activities that were very visual to help people connect with their own bodies. We would do body maps. Where does loss sit in you? To help people connect with themselves. Because if you're not in the present moment with yourself, it's really hard to go back and reflect on where you've been, isn't it? Right? And the meaning that you'd make of that. And the complexity of oscillation, the complexity of push, pull, start, stop, it's not a straight line, are reflected in both the loops. The lines here are deliberate. The arrows that are multi-directional are also clear. And then the real challenge of I attach to myself again and I'm okay, good to go. But at the same time, there's a tone of anticipating more losses all the time. It's not an event in time that we've ended and now we can look at it. It's happening still around us, different degrees, different ways. And then ongoing loss events, right? And how that feels. The thing that we noticed from our research, our multiple loss questionnaires, was anger and depression right up front and intense, really intense. So then we had to help people figure out what to do with those super big emotions and to acknowledge, okay, you've got anxiety floating around and then anger and depression floating around. How do we actually communicate that and work with that? And we started developing tools like the emotional wheel, right? We'd normalize a range of emotions. We'd give people language to talk about how confusing it feels and how I don't want to go forward. I don't want to attach. I need to attach because I want to have a life and a lover and friends, but complicated because I'm working through all this tension. And then trying to figure out, are we entitled to full range of feelings and what would that be like? And sometimes in this grief work, it was interesting conversations in community. Am I entitled to joy? Am I entitled to pleasure? Am I entitled to a cessation of pain? Because pain keeps me connected to my history. And if I let some of the pain go, am I minimizing the intensity of my connection to a community that's died or to a particular person I love dearly, you know? So we had to figure out, is it okay to be okay? Is it okay to be okay? And that seems like a small question, but it wasn't a given. Is it okay for you to be okay? And what would that look like? And is it okay for you not to be okay as you continue to move forward in your life? And you know, you learn you just got to be space for both, isn't there? Right? And you know, when you're looking at this map in a more pragmatic way, you'll have the story about the despair. But people were very clear when we were drawing this initially. It's got to be messy. It's got to be back and forth. It can't be one direction, one solid image like this, because there's nothing in the experience that feels like that. And so we'd say to people, here's a marker, draw what it's going to look like. And people would come and they'd draw these little loops and then they'd go, no, it's got to be more intense. And the phrase would be things like, I think I'm on the pit, right? I've got my face in the basement and the cement in the basement, and I don't think you can go any lower. And then somebody's going to open a trap door and there's going to be a new dimension of hell. And I've got to, and as people would say these things in that room, you know, with 23 people from the Ottawa retreat, they'd laugh. Their response was recognition, you know, not somebody telling a shockingly horrible story. It would be, yes, that's how hard it gets. It would be just an experience of relief in the room where people would laugh when it got really messy. And I thought, then it's right? If this is the visceral experience in the room, then we're doing good, right? This conversation is actually, it was going to say legitimate, like it would ever be illegitimate, but there's a legitimacy to their experience that we're going to now talk about is what loss looks like in this sector. And then the other thing we saw here with this level of despair, we couldn't go around the conversation about suicide, right? We just couldn't go around it. And in community, because lots of counselors were scared, if you open it up and what's going to happen if I bring this to my counselor? Am I going to get formed? Am I going to, you know, what's going to happen? So we had to figure out ways to talk about, if I'm still here, what does it mean to still be here? Do I want to still be here? To have a serious conversation about what that meant in a multiple loss community, a saturated community. And the language we came up with as we're looking at what's left, you know, that maybe I don't want to die, but maybe a part of me needs to die. A hope or a dream or an expectation about what my life was going to be like in my 40s, what I thought community would be like, what I thought my work experience would be like. Now that I'm on, you know, disability and these heavy duty AIDS drugs, maybe a part of me that was a hope or dream needs to die. Maybe all of me doesn't need to die. And the minute we started inviting that conversation in community, relief for people, because then we could say, I'm letting go of a part of myself. And I have the tools now to be able to mourn that, a process, a framework, my own rituals that I apply. And I can let go of a part of myself. And then I can turn to face, who am I going to be now? And that, I just like the relief about being able to have the real conversations and then to give people a different framework. This is where frameworks are so important to me, a different cognitive perception or question to be able to look at their suffering and say, maybe a part of me needs to die. And what would that look? Let's just explore that, you know, and then the conversation about, you know, what's lost. And we will mourn that in community. What's left that supports the movement towards agency, right? Victim to agent is, what would it look like and feel like as people are being able to move forward? And then, of course, right, what's lost, what's left? Okay, I'm here, got a community here. And then it was interesting. The third question, what's possible, became, well, we need to do something with this. Right? When you're working with a group of long-term survivors who've got a sense of agency, then it became a real challenge about how are we going to work with this within the HIV sector so that these folks who have done their emotional work, who are standing here, have a legitimacy in community where their work, their effort, their experience has meaning. So there we start, that became the Turning to One Another project and peer engagement in community, right? What's lost, what's left, what's possible. So it became an expansion of the HIV sector, agency contribution of the long-term survivors and agencies, which then has its own evolution. But this notion, I remember hauling these 16 pages of, it filled the whole room. And then people being, well, you can't keep hanging that on the wall. You got to do something with it. And that became work with a designer, Aries Chung, that we worked with for a long time. And Anna Dimitrakopoulos, who was part of the project then, that was really helpful in being able to put things into visual tools that we could put on a wall, that we could give people a little piece of paper with this journey on it, because people wanted a little journey they could put in their back pocket. People would take the 8x11 home and put it on their fridge and every day stand up and go, well, where am I now? Like use it as a check-in. And partly what we had done with this was we also developed one that was maybe 12 feet, 16 feet, like a giant one that would sit in the middle of the floor. And when we would do this in a circle with a group of people, we'd invite people to stand or to lay down or to sit down on the spot that felt like them, so that you were not just pointing at, which is, let me talk about my grief, but when you're sitting in it, then it becomes an experience of, I'm here today, might be in the pit today, this pit of, these swirly springs. And I look around me and I have a story that has brought me here. And I have a possibility for a story that moves forward. So being able to be enveloped in the story, I thought was really important for people. And then when we would do work in agencies, we could say, come and stand, locate yourself, sit down on a location that feels like where you are right now. And then you have an interesting group conversation. People say, how have you, continued to use this tool? And because the language is not changed from the words, and this is the English map, but you remember you've got a French one and a Spanish one, the words are belly words, right? Like they're belly words. They're not tried to be made. They're not tried to be prettied up. So when people see the words, tell me what depersonalization means. Tell me what disassociation means. Tell me what, and then you go, well, this is how I understand it. And they'll go, yeah, that's me. People see themselves in something, and having a location for what you're experiencing, that's everything for people. We have a beginning of a conversation, and I work with this map still in the harm reduction work that I'm continuing to work in, and how I've adapted that, because those deaths are frequent, they're expected, but you can't anticipate who, so it's hard to prepare. The nature of the drugs on the street, the way that COVID has shut things down, the way that people are not getting the supports that they need. What I'm finding in the harm reduction teams is it's useful to talk about suspension bridges, if this is making sense. Like, we just need to find ways that we can acknowledge what's happening, but we don't have time or even the tools when we're isolated because of COVID. Grief in its work is social, right? Grief is social, right? Grief work is, let me bring to you that my beloved has died, and the community recognizes that and supports you, and then integrates you back into community as you're coming out of your grief work. Hard to do grief work on your own. Hard to do grief work virtually sometimes. The experience of being held by community, I think, is visceral and important because it's nonverbal. So talking with workers about suspension bridges, you got your work to do, and you got to get through this week and this time, and how are you going to do that? And I think a good strategy for people, for workers and for teams right now, is to say, I'm consciously building a suspension bridge. I'm not dissociating, I'm not depersonalizing. I'm building a suspension bridge that's going to structurally allow me to go from here to next week and then to come back again. But I am saying to my team, there's stuff going on and it's impacting me deeply. And I'm putting things here as placeholders. And we are going to come back to that every 6 months, every 4 months, seasonally. Like, I think we can ask workers to be on a suspension bridge. And I think we can ask workers to hold for a period of time, but we can't pretend nothing's happening to them, and we can't ask them to hold forever. So, what's the point of a suspension bridge? Support and stabilization. We can say real things to each other, and then we help each other. What's going to help you for today? How am I going to support you for the rest of the week, right? This notion of self-care and consistent and collective care. But this is only useful when we can say to people, we're going to drop back in at some point and actually acknowledge where you've been. So to end this, I want to go back to the Survive to Thrive peer facilitator training. These were, in here you'll see Renee again and Dwayne Fitton. And I'm looking at this and I see the living and I see the dead. And I think, well, it's still a whole group for me. That even if these people have died, right, dear goodbye to Randy, who died recently, that their energy, their life force, their determination to get words right, to paint pictures, to do something, like this became the group. We were training facilitators to be able to do long-term survive to thrive groups in their regions. And this became the group of people that got on board for the 2006 International AIDS Conference that was held in Toronto. And they held a PHA lounge. They brought the Survive to Thrive. They had a little map made up of Survive to Thrive that they'd give away to people. It folded up in the back pocket. And it was a beautiful thing. And they would host people in the PHA lounge to be able to come and talk about grief and loss. These guys, these guys who could just, barely had enough energy to get out of bed some days, came and actually worked at the 2006 conference and then became the core group of the Turning to One Another project. And if you're interested, I think it would be useful to actually post this as part of this discussion. They went on, the downtown Toronto group, to make a little movie, Survive to Thrive. And it's now on YouTube, and I think it's in 3 sections. But to talk about their experiences of survival, to talk about their experiences of the multiple loss journey and how they lived the experience in the day-to-day. So I think that would be a useful reference to get into the ABRPO. Talking about the multiple loss journey. When you work with the community over time with the multiple loss journey, and you help people with the what's lost, what's left, and then help people with what's possible, stuff happens. And stuff happens. And if you're asking those questions, then as service providers, as agency, as community leaders, you need to be able to support the next evolution of the conversation about where people want to go. So I think that's what I was just looking at, these smiling faces. Nothing about these retreats is easy. There's nothing simple. This was heart-wrenching. And look at the faces of people who are saying, our stories being captured here in a way that makes sense to us, and we're going to move it forward. So part of the work, lots of tools that would go to all kinds of conferences. And back then there were more words and images. Practical tools. Think about what a gift that is in surviving and thriving with ongoing loss, like a practical set of tools that you can work with, intervention frameworks for long-term multiple loss survivors. Like, just think about how good it feels for people to say, oh, I've got that. I've got the multiple loss journey. I can do this. I can do that. There are questions I can ask. Like, just the way that helped people feel like their story mattered, their pain mattered, and they could do something with it besides just feeling broken and lost. Okay. And still saying goodbye, Personal memorials, community goodbyes, right? I'm just looking at these slides and seeing people that are still here, but in, different shape than they were back then, and people who are not here. And I think a part of me will be saying goodbye forever. And I think what's helpful about just having a tool like the multiple loss journey is in those days where I still feel like batshit crazy, and I say that with all due respect, just like I don't know how to make sense of this. I can hang on to, oh, I'm just in one of those little loops in the basement today, and I know what to do about that. I need to honor it, not run from it, not be scared of it, to just sit with this discomfort, and then my brain will sort out what's going on. Or I'll understand it's an anniversary that I don't even remember the days anymore. And I will find a way to light a candle, to honor a place and time. And I live in the country now, so I can go plant a bush for somebody I'm remembering. I can go burn things in the fire pit in the backyard, but to not try to run from that place. I don't live with HIV in my body, but there isn't any part of that story, my story as a lesbian and queer community, that hasn't been altered by the experience of living in a community saturated with death and saturated with the story of HIV.